It's the Fair Fight Initiative, and as you've been scrolling through our broken system, which we've laid out for you on fairfightinitiative.org, we hope that you're starting to understand how these stakes continue to rise as you move through this system, and how each step of the way, all of the power and all of the agency is in favor of this stacked system that has really little to do with either your innocence or your guilt, or even the severity in some cases of your crimes. And then David Utter, our executive director, it comes to sentencing. So the stakes couldn't be higher at this point. Perhaps a person has been under such pressure to take a plea bargain that they have decided to cop a plea because conditions in jail were so unbearable, because the cash bond was so high, because the representation that they had, perhaps from an overworked public defender, was not adequate to get the facts of the case forward and get the outcome perhaps that they deserved. Then they get in front of a judge and they face sentencing that is grossly stacked against most defendants to begin with, and even worse for marginalized people.
Yeah, it is one of the biggest causes of America's mass incarceration problem. America sentences far more people than necessary for public safety purposes to our prisons for far longer sentences than is necessary. There's a couple different things going on here. One is the way that we punish people with mental illness or with drug addiction with sentences to prison. It is something that completely ignores what is a mental health disorder, something that is treatable, something that is largely beyond their control unless they're getting treatment. And it's something that when somebody is sentenced to prison and it's founded on a crime that is basically because of the mental illness or their drug addiction, the judge thinks, and maybe even the DA thinks, that they're going to receive treatment. And that is incredibly rare in the United States prison system. I can tell you in the Deep South, it just doesn't happen. So they're sentenced to a place for years on end where they're not getting what they need to address their underlying issues. And then the other thing that America does is sentence people to prison for far longer than necessary. We have 80-year-old people in the infirmary in America's prisons, never going to be a threat to our community, but we just keep them in there locked up because their sentence says so. Makes no sense, completely unfair, and until we address this issue, America will always lead the world in mass incarceration, which is a shameful to be a leader in.
And yet again, the COVID pandemic showed us how unfairly the sentences are handed out to people of color, so that when the pandemic came about and the Bureau of Prisons actually made the right decision to let people go, of course, the people with the shorter sentences got out first. And they were predominantly white, and the percentage of black people in prison actually increased because of it. So David Utter, with every incentive in place for a judge, particularly in state courts, most of whom are elected and want to get reelected by not handing down a sentence that ends up blowing up in their face somewhere down the road, for prosecutors who want to appear tough on crime, and for an entire system that is a multi-billion-dollar industry to house, clothe, feed, telephone, and provide health care to so many people. What chance does a person have in sentencing?
The key with pretty much any part of the system is having a lawyer that has the time to adequately defend you, to build a case for a reduced sentence, to build a case for a sentence less than prison, right? Because when you're sentenced to probation, that's still a sentence. There are still great restrictions on your liberty. But the most important thing is to have somebody that has the time to really understand you, understand your case, and put the best possible foot forward in terms of an argument to the judge for as fair a sentence as possible. One thing I want to say here is just this incredibly misguided notion that's being pushed by law enforcement primarily, that unless somebody is sentenced for years and years in prison, then the system is being lenient. Now, that's not to say there aren't white people. Stuart Rhodes comes to mind. Yale Law School graduate, sentenced to 18 years for seditious conspiracy. And everybody goes, wow, that's a long time. I've got black clients that got sentenced for twice that for nonviolent offenses because it's their third nonviolent offense. This system was built to control black people, especially black men, everywhere from arrest to sentence to probation, through and through. It started out with our, like slave patrols, like police in the deep South were hired mainly to chase runaway slaves in the 17 and 1800s. So, all the way, from slave patrols all the way to Nixon, establishing the war on drugs. The system is, inherently racist, inherently biased, and it's part of what America has to come to grips with if we're ever going to stop our addiction to mass incarceration.
And hopefully at this point, after scrolling through our broken system here on fairfightinitiative.org, you're starting to understand the origin of this organization. But ask yourself at this point, when you think about sentencing, where the action would be for a plaintiff's attorney who makes their living scoring big judgments and reaping a contingency fee from that judgment. There is simply no action on the plaintiff's side in civil court to defend people who have been unfairly sentenced, because there's very little monetary reward. And so in steps the Fair Fight Initiative, where with your crowdsourced donations, we can make examples of this broken system, of broken sentencing, of racist sentencing, and send a message that it has to stop. And the way we can do it is by hiring experienced lawyers who no longer need the monetary incentive to bring the case.